I've recently been delving into the Bendy and the Ink Machine series to try and justify some Funko Pop purchases that, until now, have just been sitting on my shelf without meaning. As such, I thought today would be a good time to dig into the first game in the series and try to make sense of the ending, an ending that throws a massive curveball out of left field that can be difficult to understand, especially on a first playthrough.
There's something I need to show you.
All right, Joey. I'm here. Let's see if we can find what you wanted me to see.
So to start with an overview of the game, we play as a character named Henry, who arrives at Joey Drew Studios in search of something his former boss and colleague, Joey Drew, sent him to find. The search leading him to discover an ink machine, and turning it on gives life to characters from the studio's past, such as its claim to fame Bendy, or at least a version of him. Henry attempts to leave the studio, but gets dragged down deeper into the murky depths as he discovers a lot of lore and a couple characters, most of them attempting to kill the poor man, but there are a few who attempt to aid. The helpful ones bringing Henry to the den of the Ink Demon, where he eventually manages to show the thing a roll of film and send him away for good, or so you might think. In reality, showing the Ink Demon the end results in what we come to know of as the cycle starting over again. Much like one of the old Bendy cartoons that you can see all over the studio, except while they replay the same every time, the cycle here is less rigid. In this game, those changes are determined by player choice, but in the sequel, the rules of the cycle are much more spelled out. I've already played the sequel, but I won't spoil it if you haven't. Just know that the cycle is a more prominent story element in that game, whereas here it's kinda just tacked on. Which leads me to something that should be mentioned before we break into more of the explanations for this game, that being that Bendy and the Ink Machine story is sort of a mishmash of writing by the studio that was underprepared for its success. If you're unaware, this game was originally released with only the concept of Chapter 1 and the very ending of the game solidified in the team's heads. However, when Chapter 1 was released, it saw such surprising support that they decided to make 5 chapters. And so, seemingly from Chapter 2 to, I'm guessing, the Ink Demon fight, they kinda just wrote as they went. This resulting in a fairly incohesive story that would be refined in Dark Revival, but isn't the most well-structured here. Anyway, to start as far back as we can, Joey Drew Studios was founded by a small team of artists and writers who would rise to prominence in the 1930s with a character they would create known as Bendy. Bendy would become an instant success for the studio and would be embraced by hundreds of thousands as the world loved the quirky little silent cartoon who was always getting into trouble. For the purposes of our story, the two most prominent men who were bringing these cartoons to life would be a man named Henry Stein and Joey Drew himself. Joey was the studio head and the shot caller, pushing Bendy to the masses as well as writing and directing for the series. Henry, on the other hand, was the brains behind the scenes. We don't know the full scope of what he did during his tenure, but it's implied that he was certainly the creator of Boris and was likely the original designer of Alice Angel and even Bendy himself. Henry was the talent, and Joey knew that. But as the show became a bigger and bigger hit, the workload had begun to become unbearable. Not to mention the fact that Joey just wasn't pulling his share of the load.
When I agreed to start this whole thing with him, I thought there'd be a little more give and take. Instead, I give, and he takes. I haven't even seen Linda for days now.
Henry would stick it out for a while, but the stress of the job and not being able to spend time with his family would eventually lead to him leaving his post. A great decision for him, but the beginning of the end for Joey Drew. Without Henry, he would struggle to keep up with the workload, and perhaps even worse, he would lose one of the few men he trusted to lead him down the correct path both morally and in a business sense as well. Joey would put up the facade of confidence, but it was an open secret that the company was struggling financially with all the new artists and creatives that had to be brought on just to fill Henry's shoes. And despite his best efforts, the show just wasn't performing like it used to. These financial woes would lead to a grandiose idea for Joey, Bendyland. A place where he could bring all the magic of the cartoons to life and bring fans into the world of this beloved idol. With this renewed vision, he would begin to forge ahead with a new directive, to bring both the theme park, and more importantly, the characters to life. His first attempt would see him hiring a man named Bertram Piedmont, a renowned amusement engineer and talented developer. Despite a tenuous relationship with his employer, Piedmont would attempt to make his dreams a reality, crafting plans, mock-up rides, carnival games, and attempting to create the lifelike cartoon characters with the use of robotics. However, despite his efforts, Joey Drew would be unimpressed, resulting in his firing. He wanted to bring these characters to life, to seemingly transfer them from the page to the world. And so, he would next lean on his contacts within the Gent contracting firm to do the impossible.
Although we're making progress, the client's expectations keep changing. What started as a machine to simply mold life-size figures now seems to be teetering on the edge of magic more than engineering. Although Mr. Drew remains convinced they're the same thing.
With the aid of Thomas Connor, a Gent contracted engineer, the ink machine would be created. The first creature coming off the press being a corrupted version of Bendy that would scare both Thomas himself as well as Joey. But with the plan of just locking that failure away from prying eyes, they would continue the process to mild success. With the machine, they would create strange bastardizations of the studio's beloved characters, the first attempts likely being the terrifying realizations of the Butcher Gang. Thomas would hypothesize that the reason for such aberrations was that the machine was just printing out soulless husks, a comment that would give the studio leader another idea.
And in response to your previous memo, if you claim that your failures are because these things are soulless, then damn it, we'll give them a soul. After all, I own thousands of them.
Using his employees as test subjects, he would begin stealing their souls, likely through ritualistic practices surrounding the candlelit seance circles, and feeding them into the ink machine. The first being the overly attached voice actress of Alice Angel, a woman named Susie Campbell. Susie was the first person to personify the character and found a real kinship with Alice. However, the studio wasn't quite feeling her in the role, and would thus give it to another woman named Allison Pendle. Heartbroken at the thought of losing her prominent spot, she would approach Joey Drew in an attempt to get it back, this resulting in him seeing her as the perfect candidate to truly bring Alice to life. This experiment would be a success and would seemingly transfer Susie Campbell into the corrupted version of Alice Angel that we see during the events of our journey. This victory opening up the floodgates as Joey would use the process on dozens to hundreds of his employees to create the ink monstrosities that Henry encounters. Which leads us from the events before Henry to the events after Henry. Now, this is all kind of recontextualized in the Dark Revival, including Henry's role in all of this, but based off what I think was meant to be gleaned from the first game, the end of Henry's adventure suggests the cycle. He's trapped reliving this loop again and again, as we can see in some of the hidden messages you find on subsequent playthroughs. Henry runs through the events, defeating the Ink Demon and then starting all over again. The only question being why we go to Joey Drew's apartment after the end, and I would assume that it was one of his final memories that Henry had before getting placed into this cartoon world. He sees that memory, and that leads him into this reoccurring prison.
All right, Joey. I'm here. Let's see if we can find what you wanted me to see.
It can all be very overwhelming, and almost none of what I've said is concrete. In fact, most of it will change in the Dark Revival, with more streamlined explanations that kind of contrast with the Ink Machine, so yeah. I do plan on making a similar video for Dark Revival in the future, but for now, thank you all for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I hope to see you all in the next one.